Welcome to Depolarizing Congregations and Communities during the election season and beyond. My name is the Reverend Dr. Leah Shade, and I am the co-founder of the Clergy Emergency League. And this is our last webinar series with the Wisconsin Council of Churches on clergy and congregations navigating the election season. Divisiveness isn't new, but it feels bigger and more pervasive than ever, with no signs of slowing down, especially in the next week or two. Our families, communities, congregations, and our country are strained by the intense polarization that limits our ability to move toward real solutions together. This webinar will focus on tools and strategies that anyone can use to foster civility, appreciate difference, and find common ground without compromising our core values. If we truly believe that all humans have value and that everyone can be part of the solution, we need to operate in ways that align with those beliefs and amplify the best of what is possible. Our goals for this webinar are for you to find ways to build resiliency in your relationships, organizations, and communities in the midst of this election season and beyond. I invite you to put your name and location into the chat along with your congregation or organization and your role in that group. During this webinar, you can also put your questions into the chat, and we are recording this webinar, so it will be available to everyone once we have finished. Before we introduce Rachel Peller, our speaker for this evening, we want to tell you about the two organizations that are hosting this session. Brianna Illiné, please tell us about the Wisconsin Council of Churches.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. The Wisconsin Council of Churches is a network of Christian churches and faith-based organizations committed to working together across our many differences. Exercising holy imagination, we help one another make courageous choices that lead towards peacemaking, social and economic justice for Wisconsin's most vulnerable residents, the vitality of the church, and the well-being of our neighbors. The council connects 21 Christian traditions, which have within them approximately 2,000 congregations, and we always say 1 million people across the state. But our resources extend well beyond Wisconsin to serve the faith community throughout the entire country. So now I'm going to hand it back to Leah to tell us about the Clergy Emergency League and introduce Rachel.
Great, thank you. Started in June of 2020, the Clergy Emergency League is a grassroots network of more than 2,600 clergy across the United States. We provide support, accountability, resources, and networking for clergy to prophetically minister in their congregations and the public square. In this time of political upheaval, social unrest, and partisan division, we need clergy to have the skills and resources for this moment. So you can visit our website at clergyemergencyleague.org, which I'm going to put into the chat. And if you are a clergy person, you can join our Facebook group to connect with us there. I'll also put that in the chat. And we've been thrilled to co-host this webinar series with the Wisconsin Council of Churches. You can watch the previous webinars that we have done. We also did one on discerning our congregation's theologies of conflict during the election season, politics, the media, and the church's role in truth-telling, and preparing for faithful nonviolent resistance this election season. All of these webinars are recorded and available on YouTube. I'll put some links into the chat, and you can also find them on our respective websites. We also want to share with you that Wisconsin Council of Churches has curated an entire list of resources called Loving Your Neighbor in an Election Season. And I'll put the link to the chat into the chat for that as well. It has everything you need for ministry, worship, and liturgy and preaching during this election season. Now I want to introduce our speaker for this evening. Rachel Peller is the Director of Wisconsin Partners, a coalition of statewide associations and community-based groups collaborating across sectors, perspectives, and communities for a better Wisconsin. Wisconsin Partners uses a relational, asset-based approach to identify common ground and address root causes. Rachel has an advanced certificate in conflict resolution and has worked with Braver Angels, the Zeidler Center, Tallahassee Town Square, and Living Room Conversations on Bridging Divides. Like many, she comes from a highly polarized family and lives in a purple part of the state of Wisconsin. So this work for her is hard, heartfelt, and highly personal. Rachel, welcome to our webinar, and thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to do my screen share, and I'm going to warn all of you in advance that I'm much more used to doing facilitated workshops that are interactive and not webinars. So you'll see in here, there'll be different opportunities where I've put in sort of like optional practices. My assumption is that a lot of you here are already sort of taking the first steps of depolarizing work on your own. And so my hope is that this is a little bit of like a train the trainer, and you might take some of these back with you at some point in lieu of me doing them with you right now. So we're talking today about depolarizing congregations and communities. The focus of this from my vantage point is going to be on that community aspect that I'm typically working in, but I would see congregations as being a form of community in this work. So why are we all here today? I think this is probably pretty clear. And if you want to add your comments to the chat, feel free. We all know that many of us have lost personal relationships because of polarization, whether they're damaged, they've gone away completely. We have divided communities and congregations. We might be worried about that threat to democracy. What happens when we can't work together, when we can't get things done, when people are at the ends of the poles and we don't have some middle ground or common ground or can't even have conversations together. We're seeing that decreased ability to take action because we're just coming at each other over and over again instead of figuring out what do we have in common, and increased violence. And there's probably many other reasons that many of you are here. So here's a reflection question to think about now or to bring back for another time. So how has polarization impacted your own life directly? But then what about indirectly? So I think it's easy to think about, here's the personal relationships that I've lost, or here's how my community or my congregation is struggling because of polarization. But when we're thinking about that indirect piece, how would our lives be different if we were better at working together across divides? What policies do you think could have passed? What could our communities look like if we were better able to work together and sort of get things done locally? So that's just something for us to think about. Why I'm here today, I won't go too much more into what Dr. Shade explained, but a quick anecdote that I like to share is that there's 5 people in my immediate family, and it was maybe 8 years ago now that we represented 5 different political parties. And so there's interesting like overlaps between all of us. There's times when I align sort of socially and emotionally with the person who I'm most politically divided with. And it's really hard. We've sometimes gone short periods, never very long, of pausing on political conversations specifically and saying we need to take a chance to heal from this. We're still going to relate in other ways, and then come back at it again when we're able to. And then this list down here of arts, faith, healthcare, those are just some of the sectors that are represented within Wisconsin Partners. And so the Council of Churches, the Wisconsin Council of Churches, has been an active core team member of Wisconsin Partners. They, along with all these other groups, are committed to figuring out what do we have in common between nonprofits and seniors, or between philanthropy and food systems. And so within that, there may or may not be work of political division. There's definitely work of working across sectors and perspectives and communities. And so some of these skills just kind of translate in all directions. But we hang on to this core belief that we need everybody. If we're going to make things happen, and things have to happen, our world is crumbling in many ways. We have immediate needs. In order for us to change those things, we need all hands on deck. And we can't get all hands on deck if we aren't figuring out how to work together. So these are three, I don't know if this is hard to tell at all. There's 3 rows here. I want you to look at this for a minute and just think about which one of these images, row 1, row 2, or 3, best demonstrates polarization. So the first one, you've got the 3 little dots on either end. Second is in the middle, and then the third is a little bit more scattered. And also think about which one of these would lead to the richest democracy, to the space where you have the most interesting conversations, can get the most done, have interesting tension. And so, of course, this top one, where you're at either pole, either end, is where we have polarization. And I want to just point out here that throughout this presentation, throughout this webinar, I'm not trying to encourage homogeneity of beliefs. To me, the second row is one of the most concerning rows that we have, where everybody is almost completely aligned on their belief systems. We want a diversity of perspectives and opinions. That's where change happens. That's where transformation occurs. That's where we grow. I want people to maintain your core values. We just don't want situations where we are completely divided and don't have some of that wiggle room in the middle. And I'll get into more of what I mean by that in a couple slides. So when we're talking about the severity of polarization, the bad news is that we have a very high level of emotional polarization. We don't like each other. So that's the polarization that I actually want us to talk about the most today, is the perspective that we have of each other. And it's not that the concern personally is that not that we're divided along the political spectrum, but that we are socially divided. That increasingly people on one end of the political spectrum do not have relationships, especially positive relationships where you can work together with people on the other end. And that's where we have concerns with democracy, violence, our ability to get things done. The good news is that we actually are less ideologically divided than we think we are. We're all a little bit dramatic, is what the studies repeat over and over again. So this is a list of a few key studies about this that demonstrate we're actually not as politically polarized as we are worried about. We have a lot of common ground when it comes to very specific key issues. And so this is I think a helpful quote in saying that there are issues that we do have high divisions on, but when you are talking about the less reported issues, when you think about what is the media covering, and the media is going to cover the items that are highly controversial, sort of clickbait issues, that's what gets popularized, and that's where we have division. But when you're talking about a lot of the sort of day-to-day issues, the majority of people have a lot of common ground. And if we focused on those things, how could we get more done? And how could we have a greater empathy and understanding of each other? So if you want to look more into this, these are improperly cited, but 3 really good studies that are pretty easy to read through about just our dramatization of polarization. So the downside, unfortunately, is this emotional polarization or social polarization that is happening. So 77% of people have few or no friends from the other side of the aisle. So again, this is that concern that we have, especially people who are far left or far right, becoming more and more insular. And so then you're in this bubble of ideology that gets exacerbated. So these are just some polls from the Pew Research Center that show up. This one up on the left is showing negative views of the opposite party. So increase that the sort of tan in the back is just generally unfavorable, and that hasn't risen too much over time, over the last 20 years. But the percentage of Republicans who have a very unfavorable view of the Democratic Party and the number of Democrats with a very unfavorable view of the Republican Party has gone way up. And that's specifically about party. And you will see that even Republicans have a more unfavorable view of their own party, and Democrats have a more unfavorable view of their own party. But then on the right, these are some of the stereotypes that people have about each other. So this is about your neighbors, or it could be about politicians, could be family members, but we're seeing that increasingly. So that increase over time, over just 6 years. Republicans say Democrats are more closed-minded. Democrats say Republicans are more dishonest, more immoral, and unintelligent, lazy. That has gone up really significantly. And so that's the piece that I'm hoping that we can work on, is building some more of that empathy for each other, helping each other have a little bit more open-mindedness about that. So first and foremost, we're not going to get as much today actually into confronting our own biases, because my focus is sort of on that external, like how are we acting within our communities? How are we acting within our congregations? But some of that is never really going to get very far if we aren't doing some of the internal work ourselves. So these are two reflection questions of thinking about this first part of stereotypes and relationships. What are my stereotypes or assumptions about the opposing party? Do I think the opposing party is, let's go back to the words, closed-minded, dishonest, immoral, unintelligent, or lazy? Is it fair that I think that? Can I think of anyone who doesn't fit those stereotypes? And if I can't think of a person who doesn't fit those stereotypes, is it because my sample size is so small? Am I one of the people, one of the 77% of people who doesn't have a close friendship with somebody of the opposing party? And is that where some of my stereotypes are coming from, that lack of relationships? And then if so, what can I do to expand the relationships that I have? The second thing that we can get into is media. So where am I getting my information? And what are the biases? There's biases in every information source. And so this is a useful graph of left to right biases in media. If you want to find this on your own, you can just do an image search for media bias chart. And then vertically, it's just showing partially like how accurate is this? And then how much of it is fact reporting versus opinions. And I do really appreciate that they break things down a lot. So I think Fox News in particular gets a really bad reputation for being inaccurate or far right. And I think importantly, we do see that the Fox News TV channel is down near that like kind of orange yellow line. I don't know if you can see that there. But then there's other forms of Fox News, like foxnews.com is up near the green. There's a local Los Angeles Fox channel that's up in one of the highest levels of accuracy, and really pretty moderate. And I think it's worth pointing out that foxnews.com is about the same level of accuracy as MSNBC, for example. So if we're going to point fingers at somebody else's media, are we being honest about the media that we are observing and taking in and listening to? There's a really interesting website, and you can get it as an app too, called allsides.com. And what they do is they have a chart like this that they rate all their sources on. And then when there's a news article that comes out, they'll show one headline from a left-leaning source, a right-leaning source, and a sort of middle source. And so right away, you as an outside person can come in and say, well, what is everyone talking about? What are the different perspectives on this? And what I like to do is, if it's really different, then go read the articles and see like what's the conversation here. And usually the articles themselves are not as polarized as the headlines are, but the headlines are an interesting place to start. So I recommend looking up this chart, looking up your own media sources, and then sort of being honest with yourself about getting fact-based media. Am I okay if it's not fact-based? And what am I sharing with other people? So before we get into sort of some of the strategies of doing the depolarizing work, I just want to share some of the core beliefs that I am coming in here with. So first of all, I believe that everyone has something of value to offer, and everyone has some wisdom to share. So there's, to me, a lot of value and curiosity in digging below. I think all of us can be sort of hyperbolic sometimes. We can get swept away in frustration and sort of say things that aren't exactly accurate to what we believe. And can I be curious to figure out what's underneath that? What's the wisdom underlying what you're saying? and bring that person into the fold and figure out how we can work together. The second is that discomfort is at the root of growth, transformation, and innovation. We cannot change the world. We cannot change our communities. We cannot change ourselves if we are not willing to sit in a little bit of discomfort. And it can be really uncomfortable at the least to have those hard conversations with people of different political views. And it can definitely be harder and worse when you are somebody who they are talking about and with. And so in talking about polarization, I do want to have everyone just pause and think about, do you have capacity to have certain conversations? When is it time for you to take a step back and take care of yourself? For things that are more personal to you, you don't need to like endanger yourself. But if you have the capacity to have a hard conversation that's going to help you grow, help grow your relationship, transform your thinking, help improve your congregation or community, here's some strategies to be able to do that. So these are the 7 habits of highly depolarizing people. This is an article by David Blankenhorn, and you just do a search for this and pull it up. David Blankenhorn went on to found Braver Angels, which is one of the leading depolarizing organizations in the country. So we're pulling from this directly, and a lot of this came from Stronger Together Fox Valley, which is a group based in the Fox Cities in Wisconsin, Appleton. They are a member of Wisconsin Partners, and they've used some of this material locally. But we're going to use these habits as our starting point and main focus of how are we doing depolarizing work. So these are the main 2. And I've again have a practice on the side, like I warned you about, that we won't do today, but something that you can take home for later. So the first one is criticizing from within. And what that means is not necessarily that you're criticizing yourself, but you are assuming that you and the other person are in the same group together. So you're not saying like you over there are wrong, but you're arguing with somebody with the assumption that you both value things like fairness or you both value kindness. You're not assuming that that person is evil. And so similarly, number 2 is you're looking for goods in conflict. You want to go into it ideally assuming that the other person isn't trying to be evil. What they're saying, they don't feel is evil. They think that what they're saying is good. You think that what you're saying is good. And there might be goods in conflict. Relationally, a good that I've noticed in my own personal life that can be in conflict is the tension between consideration versus compassion. So those are both positive, kind qualities, and sometimes those can be at odds with each other. If someone is like very thoughtful, sometimes they can be less compassionate. If someone's very compassionate, they can be less thoughtful. I can get into that later, but just to point out that it's not always a good versus evil. So if you were to ever bring this back, or if you want to practice it on your own with somebody later, if you want to bring this back to your congregation, here's one pretty easy practice that you can do together. This would be about 5 to 10 minutes. So you choose any topic to discuss. I put democracy in here as a concept because it's one that we were talking about recently. And so you choose a question. So do we have a democracy today? Why or why not? But you could do this about any topic. And I would recommend not doing one of those super high button issues. You could talk about something local to your own community or something that's relevant to your congregation. And then just take turns thinking about like listening to each other and then actively thinking about and processing either number 1, criticize from within, or number 2, looking for goods in conflict. So if you're looking for criticize from within, a question you might ask is, what are some of the values that you and this other person share that you're noticing just from listening to them talk for only a few minutes? And then what's interesting about how those values lead you to different conclusions? And then second, what are some of the goods you hear in the other person's position? And especially if you disagree with them, this can be pretty painful to do and pretty hard to do. But can you listen for, are they compassionate? Are they fair? Do they really value hard work? And what are the values that you share with that person? These next 4 characteristics of highly depolarizing people, I think, are kind of useful as a cluster. So number 3 is counting higher than 2. So there's often not a binary way of thinking. There's multiple ways to solve the same problem. Can you get to that together? Or are you talking in ways that are either or? And how can you change that in the way that you're thinking about a problem? Number 4 is doubt. So doubt yourself a little bit. Be open to the idea that if you had different information, you would be willing to change your mind. You may be very picky about what that information actually is or what that evidence is, but there's a little bit of openness there. And you're not saying, you try to avoid things like never and always. Number 5 is specify. So be really clear about what you're talking about, and ideally consider each issue separately, being as accurate as possible. So rather than talking about something, even like a hot button issue, like don't talk about abortion, talk about third trimester abortions and focus in on one specific issue. Number 6 is qualify. And so really you're just giving exceptions. So I believe this when blah, blah, blah happens, or I believe this when this is not the case. And that can be unusual for us to do because a lot of the media and encouragement in our society is to make these very firm statements, like this is the case, sort of no matter what. So it can be hard for us to sort of be vulnerable by giving those exceptions in what we're saying, but it actually helps demonstrate competence on our part. So this is another practice to do that I would recommend. And one way is to do it as a letter. The other way is to have it in conversation with somebody. So choose any topic that you care about. So it could be guns, immigration, the economy, and then write a letter to somebody else about that issue and explain why it's important to you. If you want to write it as a letter to the editor, if you want to write it as a bulletin, if you want to write it as a blog post, whatever writing style is comfortable for you, great. But assume that the person that you're writing to is on your side. Assume that they agree with you as you're writing this. And one thing that I think is so powerful and interesting about this depolarizing work is that there are a lot of us who have started thinking about and being active in our depolarizing work when we're talking to somebody that we know we disagree with. So if I'm a Democrat and I'm talking to somebody that I know as a Republican, I might be more careful about not being hyperbolic. I might specify, I might count higher than 2. I might be careful about the words I'm choosing. But then if I'm going and having another meeting with somebody else later in the day, and I know that person agrees with me on most things, the way that I talk might change drastically. And suddenly I might be putting down the people I disagree with. I might be making big exaggerations and generalizations. And that causes a lot of problems for us. So if we're in a public place, somebody might overhear us. The person that we're talking to might actually not agree with us on everything that we think that they agree with us about. Just because somebody is aligned with your political party, I think we hope that most people have a little bit of variance within their perspectives within each party and that they're thinking critically for themselves and not just on party lines. So you might accidentally insult the person that you're talking to either on their own, or you might say something pretty awful about somebody that they love and care about. And then the third issue really with doing that is that it's getting us in the practice on our own over and over again of saying those things and thinking those things. And then when we're having a conversation with somebody that we disagree with, we feel out of practice. And so then those conversations can feel cold or inauthentic because we're just being careful. So this is one practice just to get to help us think about how do we use these depolarizing habits within in-group conversations with the understanding again that like we talked about earlier, we all are more aligned than we think we are. So these are just some questions that you can review in that letter, looking at these habits 3 through 6. So what is the core problem that I'm trying to address? What are other possible solutions? And is there a way to find common ground without compromising? So compromise, right, is when you both give up a little bit of what you want and meet in the middle. Common ground is when you think about what is underneath these solutions that we're focusing on, and what is in common about the thing that's underneath it. So if you think about the color green and the color purple, if you were to compromise green and purple, you'd get the color brown. If you were to do color theory and separate green out into blue and yellow, and separate purple out into blue and red, suddenly you both have blue. So you can make the blue happen. How can we make the blue happen? Find that common ground, move something forward, and then deal with the other part of that color separate. 4 is, what alternate viewpoints would I consider if provided the right information? Is there evidence that makes me question my current position at all? Did I make any generalizations? If categories didn't exist, if I couldn't say something like summer or winter, if I couldn't say something like Democrats or Republicans, what would I say instead? What descriptions would I use? And when specifically are the points that I'm making true, and when aren't they? So be clear about what we're talking about. And finally, the 7th habit right at the bottom is just keep the conversation going. So we are not aiming for a tidy conclusion, either positive or negative. Our goal is to not storm out of the room and have said something terrible that ends that relationship. And we're also not trying to say, okay, well, we've figured everything out and we're done with this conversation. At the end of a conversation that we're doing this depolarizing work, our goal is, do you want to talk again sometime? We brought up some really good points. How do we continue this later on? So I've asked the 2 reverends to help us out with this sample script. This is just a fun example of 2 dogs doing some of the worst parts of a depolarized conversation. So Leah and Brianna, if you will do us the honors.
Okay, here we go. Well, the humans have abandoned us again. Another day alone at home. Just you and me, pal.
Those humans just don't have the big heart we have. What did we ever do wrong to deserve this kind of treatment? All they ever do is forget we exist and then expect us to be all excited because they've bothered to return?
They don't care about us at all. They just want to spend time with other humans and act all important. Like, ooh, wow, look at me. I'm a human and I wear big shoes. Big deal.
It's worse than that. I smelled another dog on them the other day. That's why they're always
No,
gone. They're seeing someone else. I guarantee they wouldn't miss us if we ran away today.
you're right. I'm done with these humans. Time to follow the sweet, sweet smell of squirrels instead and be free of this relentless heartache.
That was our first time doing a read through. I think you both should get acting awards. Phenomenal. Thank you so much. So this is a conversation between 2 people on one side of a polarized position who are talking with each other about somebody else, somebody that they disagree with. And I like this one because it's cute and funny, but I'll give you a minute of silence if you can try in your head to find every single one of those 7 habits in here. So can you count higher than 2? Do you see the doubt? Where is there a lack of specification? I'll pause for a second for you to think about that. Okay, so right under this first one that we've got from Spot, we see criticizing the other side without finding any common values. They're immediately jumping to those humans don't have the big hearts that we have, rather than thinking something like, oh, we all care about each other, but they have to do something else. Silly dogs. There's number 3 in this part where they're thinking about it as it's a binary situation. There's only 2 options. Either they remember us or they forget we exist. And then there's 6 of this lack of clarifying. So there's an always and never framing. It's not saying when this happens, than this. It's just sort of saying like all they ever do is forget. They expect this. Down under FIDO, we've got assuming bad intentions. You're assuming like a good versus evil paradox instead of good versus good. 5 is a total lack of specification. It's a very broad generalization. All they want to do is spend time with other humans. They just act all important. They don't care about us at all. Those are huge sweeping generalizations. Then we've got 4, there's no room for doubt. They say, I guarantee this is why they do XYZ. And then 7 is an end of the conversation. So even though these two people are talking with each other, I would describe that as an end of the conversation because they're not staying curious with each other and they're not staying curious with the person that they're antagonistic with. So thank you again for the really fun dramatic readout. So I think it's important that we can all speak and listen with curiosity and authenticity. So a lot of the depolarizing conversations can really end up in us being sort of sterile and careful. And what we want is to be honest. You want to be able to speak your perspective. You don't want to water yourself down. You want to be able to share what you're thinking and why. And can we do that in a way that respects and honors another person and keeps that conversation going rather than shutting things down? And we want this to happen with people on both sides of the aisle. So if we agree with somebody, sometimes it's hard to be curious. We make assumptions about what we think they believe, and we stop asking questions. We stop really digging into it. So this goes in both directions. So a big goal is speaking and listening with curiosity and authenticity. And then I have one example that's not a dog example, but a little bit more relevant. So this is that very top one is something that I've heard from other people as a polarized statement. Somebody might say there's no point even trying to find common ground with Republicans anymore. They're all brainwashed by Fox News. It's just gotten worse in the last few years because of Trump, and I'm exhausted. And then below, so one of these is if you were this person saying there's no point even trying to find common ground, how can you say that? How can you say the things that you're really saying in a less polarized way? So that's what that one is. And then the one below in the red is if you heard somebody else say this, how could you respond to reduce some of that polarization and still demonstrate some empathy and understanding? So one thing that you can say instead is, I'm feeling really frustrated. It's okay to have feelings. It's okay to be exhausted or frustrated. And then this person says, you know how my mom's a Republican? It seems like we used to have an easier time finding common ground on political issues. It's just gotten harder recently. Sometimes I want to stop trying to make it work. So you can share the things that are hard. You can talk about the division that you have. But you can see in this one that you're not making big generalizations about all Republicans or the Republican Party. You're speaking for yourself and saying, my relationship with my mom has gotten hard. And you're also not blaming her only for that, or you're not blaming her media or her candidate. You're just acknowledging the reality that like this has gotten tricky. So that's something that you could say instead if you're trying to make the same point. And if you heard somebody else saying this, what could you say in response? And we didn't really get into that as much in today's webinar. But one example is I can get tired of the polarization too. It feels harder and harder to have conversations across the aisle. I think everyone is a little exhausted by the division, and a lot of the media isn't helping the situation. So you're being increasingly specific. You're not saying all media, but a lot of media. So you're bringing in media other than Fox News into this conversation. You can still demonstrate empathy. I'm tired of the polarization. We're all tired of the polarization. And by doing that, you're also helping that person see like we all have this in common. You're frustrated by this polarization, and so is your opposition. We're all in this together. So just to quickly wrap us up at this point, I wanted to pull up the 7 habits of highly depolarizing people again. We've got criticize from within. So that's sort of like thinking about the other person as being in your in-group, assuming that you have some shared values that you're coming from. Look for goods in conflict, good versus good instead of good versus evil. Count higher than 2. ending that binary thinking. Number 4 is doubt. Give yourself a little bit of an open mind, allow space that if you got new information, you could change your perspective. Specify, be as specific and clear as possible. Try to avoid major generalizations. 6 is to qualify. So saying when this, then blah, 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 or when that. And then 7 is to keep the conversation going. To wrap us up, I just wanted to list some really key resources. This was a very quick overview webinar. But if this is something that you're interested, I recommend some of these sources. So Braver Angels has done a lot of depolarizing work. They were founded by David Blankenhorn, who created these 7 habits. Allsides.com is the media site that I brought up earlier. The Listen First Project has really good studies and sort of conceptual information. They have a lot of statistics about that emotional polarization that we talked about earlier. If you are in Wisconsin, I recommend connecting to the Wisconsin Civic Health Initiative, joining the community conference. There's a lot of groups in that arena who are really working on how do we get out the vote, but also how do we build relationships with our neighbors. And then finally, Living Room Conversations has really great conversation templates that you can just get for free online. So you can pick almost any topic that you can think of, bring together a group of 5-6 people in your living room or in your church for a book club in your neighborhood, and use that model as a way to have interesting conversations with each other. So I think this concludes our webinar for now. We're opening it up to Q&A at this point. If anybody wants to contact me, my email is right there. And I'm wondering if you think I should close the screen share.
Yes. Yeah, if you could do that, that way we can all see each other. First of all, thank you so much, Rachel. That was really, really helpful information, and something that, again, no matter what happens with the election, having these kind of strategies and looking at our own situations and thinking about how in our own sphere of influence we can bring down the temperature and find some common ground is really helpful. We have a comment in the webinar chat that I want to bring to your attention and see if you want to speak to that. At one point, you showed a slide of the different media outlets and how biased they are and whether they're factual or opinionated. And one of our attendees, Robert Franek, wrote, I find that more than political bias, corporate bias influences major media outlets from print to cable. So I wonder if you can speak a little bit to what influence money has on the polarization that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the media inflammation and polarization is rooted in the influx of money and the reality, especially of that going to the internet. And we're looking at how many clicks or comments does something have. I think a lot of you know this, rather than what's just the most factual information. And so to me, one strategy in addressing that or combating that is to go to a source like that media bias chart and focusing your own clicks or your own time and energy on some of the most accurate reporting. And there's not really a lot of point in engaging. There's no point in putting a sad face reaction on Facebook, or making a comment is usually not the most productive way to spend your time on social media, because that actually demonstrates to those media companies, this is an article or this is a headline that's going to get attention, and we don't care whether it's accurate or inaccurate. We want the attention, because that's how they get the money coming in. So if you're thinking about a strategy, disengage from any inflammatory media as much as possible and focus your resources, your own time, on the ones that are more accurate.
That's really helpful. Yes, the algorithms and
The
how that
algorithms.
drives. Yes, how that drives is really important. We have a question in the Q&A from Brett Myers. When people are believing in lies, what is the best way to respond? And I get this question a lot because when there are people who are, you know, believing things that are obviously not true, and you try to engage in conversation about just simply the facts or reality, and they're just not there. What do you do with that kind of situation?
I would love other people's responses to this too, because it's not something that I have like a 100% surefire way of responding to. In general, I will say that curiosity is one of the best ways to go, and figuring out what's underlying their belief in that lie. Um, there's uh, there's a Buddhist named Pema Chodron who talks about how fear in our bodies is rooted in discomfort, and that discomfort was originally a survival response. So a lot of our discomfort is things like, am I cold? Am I hungry? Am I wet? Am I tired? And that discomfort tells us we need to get warm, we need to go to bed, we need to get food or water. And so still today, our bodies, when we're uncomfortable, we feel fear because we're in survival mode. And we haven't totally unprogrammed ourselves that when we're in uncomfortable situations of confronting people who we're not used to, new ways of living or being, whatever it is that's happening in the world with all these changes, a lot of people are feeling discomfort, are noticing discomfort, and are feeling it as fear. And when you are fearful, you hold on to anybody who's giving you answers and believing that your fear is valid. And so the more that we polarize, the more that those lies are going to be believed, because we've become these echo chambers where everything is truth and we're only talking to people who agree with us. All to say, um, when I'm engaging with somebody who's believing in what I perceive to be lies, I tend to try to be curious first and say like, oh, like, where did you hear that? I would like to read more about it. Like, that seems unlikely to me, but I want to be a little doubtful too and say like, if that's true, like, please show me. Like, I would be shocked to hear this, but if you have a good source, I'm open to hearing that. Um, and sometimes you can go with that person like through sort of a critical media analysis. So if they're struggling to find out, to get their source, talk them through how you find good sources. So it's not just in this moment, the specific lie that they're believing now, but how can you build that person's capacity to identify when media or people are sharing things that aren't true? And just in general, anybody's less likely to believe lies when they feel safe. So how can you build an ongoing relationship with that person that they feel safe coming to you? They want to keep coming to you for conversation, and they're no longer in an echo chamber.
Yeah,
But good
that's
luck.
really helpful. Yeah, yeah. And I think too, naming that emotion that, um, it sounds, um, you know, wait, when whatever the situation is, how do you feel about that? How does that make you feel? Because
Yeah.
emotions are neither right or wrong, they simply are. And so getting to the emotional level before you try to dispute the facts,
Mm-hmm.
I think is also really important.
Yeah, that's a great point.
We have another question about, uh, so when one position is actually trying to deny human rights, um, do at what point do we just have to say that this is wrong? I'm recalling a quote from Elie Wiesel, who said, "Always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented." So when we're thinking about, that we're trying to keep things neutral, you didn't use the word neutral, but just trying to listen and engage. At what point is this just simply enabling these really harmful views that are targeting people and stripping people of their rights and that sort of thing?
Mhm. Um, so I would say I'm focusing in particular on the polarization of our relationships more than our political polarization. So I don't think there's an issue with being at a political end. and voicing that perspective clearly and authentically and honestly, or speaking from the middle. And in terms of human rights shouldn't be a polarized issue. I think a lot of us would believe. But there are ways, like, how are we having these conversations? So a sort of depolarized way of communicating would be like, I disagree with what you're saying. Here's why. I know that that's a human rights violation, or here's why I'm concerned about what you're saying, and talk about that. You should be able to have interesting, rich, good conversations where you're challenging each other. The goal is not to avoid having political discussions, but to have them in constructive ways instead of ways that antagonize, dehumanize, and isolate each other. It would not be a productive way to say, like, you're an idiot for believing this, because that's going to shut that person down. It's dehumanizing them. They're going to end that conversation, and they're going to go back to their echo chamber. They're going to go back to their bubble, to the people who do agree with them, where they're more likely to get further and further into a belief system that denies human rights, if that's the concern. So the more that we can stay engaged in those conversations and keep it going, be firm about your belief or your viewpoint on what you're hearing and seeing. But you don't want to, like, ideally not shut somebody down, especially if you're able to have a one-on-one relationship with that person.
It's a tricky
Brianna,
situation.
if you have more to add.
I've talked about this a lot. I talk about having boundaries. I think this is a skill we all need, of like, hey, I will keep a relationship with you, but also I'm not going to let you speak that way. Like, I don't, and having strong boundaries, but also, especially if you are someone with privilege, like, there is a reality of, like, privilege plays into this game, and we need to be aware of that. But if you have the privilege to keep showing up, point number 7, of like, no, I'm going to keep showing up. You don't get to, like, have these views and then just sit in your echo chamber. I'm going to keep showing up and pushing you on them. The example I use a lot as a female clergy person, there are people who don't see me as clergy. And so I'm going to show up in rooms that are uncomfortable for me, where my identity pushes against the understanding of that group, and say, no, we're all in this together. We are all part of this church. And so I think it's figuring out where those boundaries are, where you can use your privilege, and just kind of keep pushing up.
Yeah, I think anytime we're having a conversation where we're actively trying to convince somebody, that can be hard and often be frustrating. My goal, if I'm imagining like a 5-point scale of people, would never be to get somebody at a 4 or a 5 to a 1 and agree with me completely. If I'm going to try to convince somebody of anything, I'm just trying to get them from a 5 to a 4. Like, that's it. I just want them to shuffle a little bit. And if they're at a 4, my goal might be, I just want to keep you engaged enough that I don't push you, that I'm not the one isolating you more into that 5 group, where then I'm a little bit concerned. So that's something that I would recommend too, as we're having conversations, is that people can change their minds. I'm an example of somebody who has changed my mind dramatically as a young adult to now. And I want us to be open to that as a reality. And it's rare that that happens immediately. It's usually a slower shift that's rooted in care and relationship, to help change that perspective or a life-changing experience.
I'm glad that you're distinguishing between the one-on-one conversations, which is really important for pastors in their one-on-one relationships with parishioners. I'm wondering then, because I'm a homiletician, what is the role of preaching in all of this? Um, you know, do you, I mean, and there, of course, there are many different ways to think about um, how the sermon functions in this. Is the sermon designed to call out the fact that there is bias or lying or rights violations going on? Or is the point of the sermon to invite people to a conversation about what our values are and how we can find common ground? Do you have any advice for preachers on that respect?
I think I would like one of you to respond more to that too, because I'm not a preacher or pastor. It's not my expertise. I'm coming at it just more from a community lens. As somebody from the outside, my perspective is just that I think a little bit that's determined on like who you are as a pastor and how your church kind of operates. That doesn't seem like a one size fits all question to me. But I do think that there is a role for honesty and truth telling um, in your role as a pastor or preacher. And just can you do that in a way that's not dehumanizing any of your parishioners, anybody that's showing up today for the first time? Is it inviting some more conversation and some understanding? So I think it's using some of those depolarizing habits that we talked about to make very firm, clear points rooted in reality and your theology, um, that just aren't pushing people away and making those big generalizations. Another thing that I like to practice is putting my energy into what I want to grow. So how do I say what I'm for and what I'm excited about instead of what I'm against? And using that strategy can be a helpful way to help get us out of some of that depolarizing, or out of some of the most polarizing things that we can say. So rather than saying like these people are doing bad things, like focus on what we want to create or what we want to work on, depending on the issue, can be one approach.
That's actually really helpful to hear a perspective from somebody outside of the church and who doesn't have a clergy role, because that's actually really insightful and on point. So thank you for that, Rachel.
Yeah,
Brianna,
if
do
you
you
do
have
want to
any?
respond to that, yeah, please do.
Well, I was thinking of a question of I'm sitting with the 77% of people who don't have a relationship across the aisle. Like that is mind blowing to me. I knew it was bad. I don't think I realized it was that bad. So like what do we do with that as churches, as communities? And even, I mean, I think about how do you find a friend? How do you build like how do you even do that? I've had numbers of people come to me and say, we want to do this work. We want to build bridges. I don't know anyone. Do I just walk into my local political party that I disagree with? Or like, what do I do?
I tried this once. I went to there was a there was a church in town. I'm more liberal. It was a more conservative church, and they were doing like some giveaway thing. And I drove up to them and I was like, "Hi, I'm new to town. I just would like to meet somebody with a different political perspective. I'm wondering if you'd ever want to get coffee with me." And she kind of looked at me funny and was like, "Well, I don't want to change my mind about something." And it just didn't go very well. So I don't necessarily recommend cold calling people and saying, "Do you want to go have a politically different conversation with me?" Probably not the best. You might have depending on where you live, you might have a ministerial association. So one of our groups, Southwest Partners in a rural area, they had a ministerial association. There was one very right-leaning pastor and very left-leaning pastor who were involved, and they were at odds with each other for a while. They were always had these political divisions. And then they both went to a community organizing training and they stopped talking about politics for a while. They focused for years on what do we have in common in our community and how can we work on those things together. And through that, they built up some mutual respect and trust. And then they were able to start, because they had started off on pretty bad terms. They had to do some like healing first. Then they were able to have interesting political conversations. One thing that I think would be great is if one pastor found another pastor, built a one-on-one relationship first, and then through that brought your congregations together and had them like cross talk, and you could invite them to do some kind of like living room conversation together. But even just having like a cross group potluck or a movie night or a whatever, where you're just building relationships without the political context, is helpful for anyone.
I also think there's that power in that one-on-one. We get this like big vision and it's who's the one person. And then once you build the one relationship, then you can be like, okay, who do you know that's on your side of the aisle that you can bring next time? And I can bring someone. I've brought people who politically align with me to more spaces that are cross aisle, kind of to be like, and they're like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I want to go. And I'm like, just come. It's okay. I'll hold your hand.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Like there's
Yeah.
power.
In my little town, there's 2 coffee shops, and everyone knows that one coffee shop is the liberal coffee shop, and everyone knows that the other one is the conservative coffee shop. That's a known
Wow.
reality in my town of small city of 5,000 people. So one thing that I could do is just go to the one that it doesn't align with my politics. And I think a
Mm.
lot of us have those spaces in our communities where you feel slightly uncomfortable. You're like a little worried that you're not going to be accepted there. And can you push yourself and just try to show up? Whether it's like a bowling alley or a movie theater or the car shop or the local diner.
Well, we are coming to the end of our time. I do want to put into the chat a resource that uh, uh, that the Wisconsin Council of Churches has, Loving Your Neighbor in an Election Season. Also, somebody put into the Q&A that I'm not sure everybody saw, something called the Dignity Index. And so if anybody wants to click on that, that's a new one for me. So that might be helpful as well. But Rachel, thank you so much for this incredible opportunity to think through these depolarizing habits. It just internally helps to reorient us, especially those of us who are doing ministry and are facing this kind of extreme divisiveness in our either in our congregations or our communities. This has been so helpful, Rachel.
Thank you for having me and thank you for doing all this work. And I just want to have a disclaimer that even as somebody who just did a webinar on this, I slip. We all slip. It is really hard to like do the right thing and say the right thing consistently when we are embedded in this world of all all the harmful things that we could do instead. So just like an encouragement that the goal is just to like keep trying and keep moving in that direction, not for perfection.
Mm, beautiful, beautiful. And again, just a reminder that all of the previous 3 webinars are available. They are in the chat. If you haven't had a chance, just scroll back up and they're all there. We will be putting the recording of this webinar on the both websites as soon as Brianna has a chance to edit them. And Brianna, could you close us with prayer?
Sure. Holy God, pour out your spirit on us gathered here and all those we are connected with. God, be with us in this time of polarization. Be with us in this time of division in our country and fill us with a spirit of curiosity. Fill us with a spirit of complexity. Fill us with a spirit that continues to show up, that continues to love. Be with us through the next few weeks and beyond as we navigate this season. In your name we pray. Amen. Thank you all.
Amen. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Brianna. Thanks to everyone online. If you can just show your love, show your appreciation for Rachel, and blessings to you all in this election season, and look forward to more webinars and resources to come.